Welcome to the Reclaim Leader podcast. I'm Jason Tucker.
And I'm Jesse Skiffington.
We're two pastors in the trenches who are passionate about church health for greater gospel impact.
We share the ups and downs of ministry, strategies that worked for us,
and some that didn't.
Best practices and practical tools for church leadership.
The goal, to help all of our churches flourish. Let's get started.
See another sunrise, sing a little song.
Oh boy, Jesse, we are back, and it is, again, we're just running 100 miles an hour, both of us, even before hitting record, just talking through a bunch of stuff in the church. You know, some of the most helpful stuff is probably the stuff we don't record, but
I know those conversations, they're getting longer every time.
I know.
We're like a half an hour in, and we're like, we're supposed to be recording right now, which anyway, it just shows that we're still figuring it out as we're going along, right? It's an adventure to be lived.
Absolutely. There's today, just thinking about a lot of topics, but selfishly, well, I don't know if selfishly, but it's just kind of where my head is now. I'm finishing up the book. I think we talked a little bit about this, working on a book about, what's the process you can lead your church through to get healthier and to reach generationally with the gospel. And it's been a really interesting process. They don't tell you that when you sign a book deal, which, then you got to write the thing. and 6-7 months sounds like a long time until you're a week out. So, so there's a lot going on, but the chapter today is all about how do you know if your church is actually becoming healthier? And I've just been thinking a lot about this and thought today's a bit more of a conversation than a solution, but I'll just sort of tell you what I'm wrestling with and where I land. And I think this is an important thing to do because I don't think we can assume that certain outcomes necessarily equate with health, or some don't. And especially when it comes to around like what metrics are we looking at, particularly numbers, because that's the easiest one. It's the most straightforward. It tells part of the story, but it could also get a little thorny. So Jesse, we're going to look at that, and maybe it's going to help me end the book because it's the last chapter.
Let's see if we can come to some reasonable conclusion for you that might help you, or at least not steer you too far off track. We want to make sure you land well. So let's dive in. Let's do it.
That's right. So I think the two most important metrics when it comes to church health, because I'm big on how do I make it simpler. So 2 is the perfect number for me to remember, is faithfulness to the mission and fruitfulness in the mission. I think if you're thinking in terms of faithfulness and fruitfulness, are we faithfully doing what we feel God's calling us to do according to the Great Commandment, the Great Commission? Are we serving our community in the way that we feel called to do that? That's faithfulness. And then fruitfulness. Is there some kind of measurable outcome that tells us we're doing it right? And that's the part I know that churches struggle with even more than faithfulness. Faithfulness, I think we all struggle with that too, but fruitfulness is, how do I know fruit when I see it? And how do we measure something that's very hard to capture? It's very subjective. When we're talking about people's spiritual lives, it's not like you could count that necessarily. So how do you navigate those two metrics when it comes to your church as a whole or a particular ministry? That's what we're talking about today. So I think the real trick is, how do you tell good fruit from bad fruit? Just because something's producing fruit doesn't mean it's good. Matthew 7. Jesus gives us this simple litmus test. And the context is he's trying to tell his disciples how to tell the difference between a false prophet and a legit one. And he says, you will know them by their fruit. So on one hand, that's spiritual discernment. If there's a principle to extract out of that, it's you can judge spiritual health by the quality of the fruit. Now, what kind of fruit are we talking about? Well, the fruit, it should look like Jesus, fruit of the Spirit. We know what that fruit looks like based on a relationship, a discipleship, a transformative journey. That's what our ministry should look like. And it's a little bit nuanced though, Jesse. How do you measure good fruit in the context of ministries, as far as like, oh, it's the quality of this fruit of this men's ministry or this women's circle or this teenage youth group?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of nuanced and subjective. I don't know. Are there ways that you have figured out how to measure that?
Well, I think maybe sometimes you have to back up a step before that to evaluate fruit, if it's good fruit or bad. And you started with, is it in keeping with the mission? So if we're expecting certain types of things because of what we're doing, have we articulated a desired outcome or a hoped for outcome? So when we talk about being a flourishing church that makes disciples of Jesus Christ here at Marine View, or being a church that creates environments where people go deeper with Jesus and reach wider with his love, the fruit that we would expect to see are people who are being disciples who make disciples, maybe, or we might look for people who are taking steps to go deeper, to know Jesus more, and then are reaching wider with his love. And we would look for evidence of a growing relationship with God, growing relationships inside the church, and growing influence in the world around us, or something along those lines. And so the fruit that we would want to see or hope to see is in keeping with that great commandment, great commission that you mentioned, that we articulate particularly in each of our churches, and is the hoped for outcome, the thing we hoped God would do in us and then through us and our community. Is that coming about? And if you've never had that conversation, it's going to be really difficult to know, is it moving us in that direction or not? Because then it's just a purely subjective kind of a deal. So if we're looking at, say, our youth environments here, have we created a place where students and young people from our community can come, learn about God's love, take steps to know Jesus more, and then be the ones who then are inviting their friends in to come and experience that too? And when we see that, we go, that's the fruit we're looking for. And so, yeah, I think it's hard because it's not just did people come or did people give, or, it's not, those metrics are part of the conversation, but how are we doing at seeing movement towards the mission? So anyway, it's a really long way of saying, if you don't articulate that on the front end, it's going to be really hard to know. And so when Jesus is talking about good fruit and not so good fruit and being able to tell the difference, he's just given a whole vision for what that looks like in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
And now we get to look for those things too. Is that person turning the other cheek? Are they, going in the quiet closet to pray instead of out on the street corner? How do we know? Well, we stated the vision first, and now we can look at the fruit and go, yes, it's moving us in that direction.
Yeah, I would say good fruit would look something like Sermon on the Mount, kingdom of heaven values over against kingdom of the world values. Right. Are we producing that through the ministries that we're doing? I think it's a great way of framing it. Again, it's a little more art than science though. And that's the thing that's tough, because and this is why there's always such an overemphasis on numbers, because that's the easiest thing that you can count. If you could count it, it makes it really easy to sort of tell a story. But I think the thing is, that's certainly not the only metric and not the only part of faithfulness or fruitfulness that matter. So
yeah, it's really tricky, because how do you measure people who are seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness?
Right.
There's sort of a qualitative aspect to it, but there's also something in that where I do think the numbers do come into play, in the sense of how do we understand people's movement toward that? Are we seeing more people coming into that, not just to grow our numbers, but people who we could look to and say, no, there is a disciple who is maturing in faith. They're growing with God in each other in community, and they're reaching out on mission in the world. And we notice more of that happening. So we go, yeah, there's fruit coming out of those lives. People aren't just static in their faith. They're growing. So yeah, it's tricky though. And I'd be curious to hear more of kind of your sense of where do the numbers come into play?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes, and I'll put myself in this camp, there are times when maybe we hide in the lane of I'm being faithful without being attentive to fruitful. And I think sometimes we have to go, well, faithfulness is going to express itself in fruitfulness. And so can we really say we're being faithful if we're just kind of playing church and going through the motions and we're not seeing a lot of sort of healthy fruit type outcomes? And that gets into a little sensitive territory. I mean, it feels judgmental to say that, to someone, well, you think you're being faithful, but you're not producing any fruit. Can you say that you're being faithful? Truly. Yeah. Because part of being faithful is stepping out, risking, trying, going, all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky, and I think this is where you may just, some churches or pastors just may want to avoid it altogether. Like, we're just going to keep plugging away and doing our thing. But the problem with that is, how are you going to know that you're being faithful unless there's some sort of framework with which you're understanding what faithfulness and fruitfulness look like? So that's where my brain's been, and
I love it.
It's sort of all rattling around, because it's not just about the quality of the fruit.
Yeah.
That, according to John 15, another thing Jesus says, it's about the quantity of fruit. He says, my Father is the gardener, I'm the vine, you are the branches, right? The Father, Jesus says it, the Father is getting rid of all the branches that aren't producing fruit and pruning the ones that do, so that they'll produce more. And whenever I hear that verse, I always think of every year when we go to Vermont on Lake Champlain, we're surrounded by apple orchards, and I'm always taken aback by the way the trees look, because none of them are the same shape. They're all pruned and clipped in these sort of odd formations, but it looks like someone literally took stacks of apples and put them on each branch. I mean, they're just filled with fruit. And so yes, it's about the quality of the fruit, but it's also about the quantity. And this is where we have a tendency to get messed up. So yes, healthy things grow. I stand by that. It's the logical outcome of vine and branch health, right? However, it can definitely become an idol or a false indicator of health, because unhealthy things grow too. So I was thinking about this, that, for example, if sin is left unchecked, it can spread everywhere fast, like poison ivy in the garden. And Carl Vaders, who we've had on a couple of times in his most recent book, De-Sizing the Church, I mean, he goes hard against bigness of the church. And I say I'm close to where Carl lands. I don't know if I would put it in the same way as him, but I did agree with this statement from the book. He said, when the numbers stay up, they capture our attention, blinding us to what might really be going on in the church, including in the pastor's own walk with God. If all healthy things grow, the false assumption is that all church growth is healthy.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I do. You could have a big, growing, unhealthy church, which is interesting, because it's just not usually the terms that we think of.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right to think, okay, what does then health look like at whatever size? And I think that's maybe where Carl Vaders is taking us, is to think,
oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. We want to be healthy, whatever our size, big, small, or medium, or whatever. And so health is the most important, right? To be healthy, because you can be a mile wide and an inch deep and blow over in the first storm, and you can create disciples that have no foundation under their feet, and they just are here for the show. And when a real crisis shows up in their life, or they're pushed on their faith and they walk away because they were never, they didn't become healthy enough to withstand the storms that are going to come, or whatever. So yeah, you can do things to grow numerically and all of that. But if you're not doing the work of cultivation, of gardening, of helping roots grow deeper as a community, and then as individual followers of Jesus, then can you really say that that's healthy growth? Well, I guess time will tell when the other shoe drops or things get hard. But I do think thinking in terms of health at whatever size is a good way to do it. And then to go, okay, so quality and quantity go together somehow, and it's related to faithfulness. And those are kind of mysterious things. It's sort of Holy Spirit-ish kinds of things that sometimes it's a feeling or a sense of the health. And I think what you're trying to help us get at is how do we actually articulate that beyond if we feel healthy or it
Right.
seems healthy or man, something's not quite right and I can't put my finger on it. Help me figure it out. And what I hear you wrestling with is how do we talk about that? How do we measure it or get some language around that can give us a way to rightfully look at what's actually happening in our churches?
Yeah. And I find myself living in the tension between Donald McGavran and the church growth movement that led to Willow Creek Seeker Church, and which then in turn inspired churches like North Point and Life Church and many others. And the discipleship corrective of folks like Carl Vaders and others over the last 10 years, 15 years, even Tim Keller to that extent. And I think I land squarely in the middle of that. So McGavran was all about getting rid of cultural barriers, and so that people wouldn't have to unnecessarily climb them in order to get to Jesus. And I think that's a faithful interpretation of Acts 15. We shouldn't make it difficult for Gentiles who are turning to God. I think that's good.
Yeah,
I agree. However, I've seen and heard how attractional church can become a monster that has to be fed. And I think the difference, I think here's the line. Any church that exists for itself more than the mission is when it gets all messed up. Because the mission should lead to discipleship, which leads to transformation of your life and those around you.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that. Now, don't get too crazy with me about this, but I was reading some Karl Barth.
Easy
Now.
You did go to Princeton, didn't you?
I did in the end. It was actually a conversation we're having about what is the role of the Holy Spirit and versus sort of the role of human beings to bring about the church, and something of a partnership in the end. But I think what you're saying, and I think is part of Bart's point and many others, is that the church is not an end in itself. It exists for the sake of Jesus and his mission in the world. And part of we're caught up in that mission as disciples and growing in that and growing in faithfulness. But the church exists for a reason, and it's the living congregation of Jesus at work in the world. And so if the church exists just to build its own reputation, to build its own glory in a sense of look how great we are, look how big we are, look how many people come. If the church is about itself and not about its Lord, then something has gone sideways. And I would say that's where health has moved to unhealth, when a church becomes about its reputation, its place, its programs, its fancy whatevers, or even the number of people. Look at how many people come, and we forget the one who's at the center of it all. That's an indicator to me that we go, are we constantly evaluating the lordship of Jesus in our midst, even as we're trying to bring this thing about in greater ways, this thing called the church? And so, yeah, I think you're right on. If the church becomes an end to itself or about its own reputation over the mission, then I think something has gone missing.
Yeah. And
so having the humility to say, and Lord, if you want us to keep going in this direction and keep seeing more and more people come, fantastic. And if you're asking us to do, fill in the blank with whatever the hard thing is, help us to be faithful and move in that direction. So yeah, maybe that's, I'm kind of processing along the way here, but I kind of thinking in terms of maybe that's an indication that something is off track when it's more about the church and less about the mission.
Yeah. And you learn a lot through stories. So I recently heard two very different stories about large churches. The first one was a negative one, and I'm not going to say what church, and the source is anonymous.
Listen, you can just say Marine View. It's okay.
No, so this was a incredibly famous mega church.
Okay. So not us, is what you're saying?
A guest went and was seated in the front row or maybe the second row and was approached by the church staff prior to the service that she would have to move and she was told, because she is not the age demographic that they want to see on camera. That is gross. I know have reasons and who they're trying to reach and all of that. But I think that's an example. That's across the line. That is showing that you're existing for your own self more than the mission, because is the mission really just limited to a particular generation?
Yeah, that's really good. And sometimes something that's done from a strategic standpoint for what could be some compelling good reason, like reaching the next generation, can drift into that just doesn't track as healthy or good, right? You just go,
I know
something's not right there.
That's a flag.
That's a value issue, right? A value that's then expressed in strategy that we will reach the next generation at the expense of others or something like that. It's unintended maybe, but those things,
it's like you're welcome to stay, but you can't be in camera shot,
Right.
And then another story, which it's only anonymous because I just don't remember his name, but Carey Nieuwhof had a guest on, I want to say maybe a month ago, maybe it was less. And I really enjoyed the interview. He was a young guy who had started a church plant, and they were like almost exclusively, like 90% were all under 30 years old or something. It was some amazing story. And one thing that he did was he talked about leaning into the relationships with older folks in the congregation, because he saw that as incredibly important for him as a pastor. He wanted wisdom. He felt like he didn't have that. And he wanted them to share with the younger members of the church just how to do the Christian life. And it was such a cool example of how I think to do it right. And those who listen to his podcast will probably know the guest. And I'm sorry, I'm just not recalling him right now. But it was such a great example of, I think, what health looks like. So in a way, I think we all have a discerning spirit to where, the Holy Spirit's doing that work for us and helping to show us where's the red flag and what just looks and feels right. So I think story might be a way to tease some of this out. What's the story behind the thing that we're doing? I think it might help you discern whether it's producing good or bad fruit.
Yeah, that's good. It's something that kind of popped in my head as you were talking about is, do people love this particular expression of the church at the expense of their love of Jesus or something? It's like, so is our church, when somebody says, I love our church, I really appreciate that. But is our church helping them to love Jesus more? Or do they just love our church? And so I think that's the remembering that that's great. You should love your church and want to be a part of it, as long as that's connected into the mission of the church and what we're here to be about. And I think sometimes if we're not careful, when the church becomes the goal over the mission, and there's a fine line there, because the church growing the body, helping the body mature, helping the body reach wider and see more people belong to it is the mission in a lot of respects. But it's what's going on in your heart. Is this so for the sake of our reputation and our glory, or is this for the sake of people coming to know a life-giving relationship with Jesus and experiencing life with God in community together? So it's like you got to be careful with that. And I think your idea of a story being a way into that, into your motivations and what's going on in your head and your heart as a leader or as your community of leaders, can be an indication. Are we moving in a healthy direction as we grow, or is this becoming more and more about us? And so something along those lines.
And I think if you're looking for something to map out on a paper, maybe again, it's coming back. We mentioned this last week, come back to Acts chapter 2 and the different ways that the early church was growing, that maturity, unity, favor, numbers, that might be a way to put numbers in their place. They're part of the picture, but not the whole picture. And then to start asking questions. And I think the funniest part about this is you could land on our good friend who doesn't know us, Andy Stanley.
That's right.
And his book, Deep and
He
Wide.
listens every week. Andy, thank you for listening today. We're so glad. Thanks for being there for us.
Deep and Wide. Although it's funny, you mentioned Andy's name now, and it gets all sorts of interesting reactions, and half the stuff I don't even know about. But I just know that his philosophy and understanding how to try and be a church that's both deep and wide is
that healthy,
very simple and wonderful example.
I think, and one thing we're working on in kind of the church world I've connected into in our denomination is, what does a healthy church look like from kind of the seed level all the way to the fruit and the
Yeah.
outcome level, and looking at it, at the church as something more of a gardening image of, you know, a seed and the soil and the root system and the trunk, and then all that leads out to the fruit that comes. But if those things aren't healthy, you know, at the underneath the surface, and if the soil's not healthy, when it, you know, the fruit is not going to be healthy. So part of that again is diving back into your vision, mission, values, what you say matters most, and trusting that faithfulness in that arena as you strategically move towards the ministry aspects where it's lived out more publicly, that it is going to produce good fruit, quality fruit, a quantity of fruit. And so, yeah, doing some of that deeper evaluation, sometimes I think for churches, the more I kind of work and talk with a greater variety of churches, I notice that it's some of the root system or kind of some of the soil work that is just that culture piece in the life of the church that's not to a point yet that where you would expect actually some good fruit to come. So let's do some work there. So in your context, you guys have worked on that for how many years have you been at it now there at Tower Hill?
12 and a half.
Right. So you've been tilling the soil, working the soil, cultivating a healthy root system, doing all the things to become healthy. And it's showing up in the trunk of the tree and in the branches and the leaves. And now there's a flourishing life, a healthiness that's coming out of all that work. And I think that would be the church health thing can be sometimes at the expressed fruit level, and then sometimes at that deeper faithfulness level of maybe there's some work that you got to get to doing first. And if you're new in a church and you're leading change and you're like, man, we have some root system stuff, a healthy church can look like getting to work in that area and trusting that the fruit will come in its due course. So I think it's a really valuable conversation, Jason, and one that, frankly, I can't wait to see where you land as you articulate all this, because it is, I think, something that's hard to get a hold of. And maybe that's on purpose. Maybe it is supposed to be elusive, because if we could figure it completely out, I don't know if that'd be good for us. But yeah, to help us think through, what does health look like and how do we measure it?
And here's what I'll say to that. Just having this conversation with your elders or with the leaders in your church may be all you need. It may be the most valuable thing you do.
Oh, totally. What do we think health would look like?
Yeah.
What are some things we would expect to have happen if we were healthy? Or what might happen if we get to work under, you know, at some of the stuff underneath that might express itself? What would that look like? And I love it, Jason. We have more questions than answers most of the time is what it comes down to. But I think you're coming to some really good conclusions as you're working on this final piece of your book and based on your experience and your study and all that. And I think it adds a really important and valuable piece to the conversation of how do we understand what a healthy church looks like, because that's what we're after ultimately, is a healthy church that produces fruit. That's what we're here for. So I can't wait to see where you land, and then we'll all read it and then we'll have it all figured out. It'll be great.
All right. Well, yeah, perfect. That's right. No, well, hey, thanks everyone for listening. I hope that this is helpful to you. And if you have found it helpful, it'd be great if you'd share it with some colleagues in ministry. And again, we're just trying to help as many pastors as possible. I think this is such an important time in our lives to hopefully cultivate some healthy churches.
Yeah.
Because man, the world needs it so badly. And so many people are hurting and don't even know that piece they're missing is right in front of them.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody here in our local community. Their church plant it's been longer than a church plant. It was about 20 years this community was meeting, and they had their last worship service a couple weeks ago and decided to finally to close. And it was heartache and loss and all of that. And then we were talking about looking for a new church, what that process is going to be like and all of that. And this person said something really helpful to me. He said, I'm not looking for a 95% perfect church. I would settle for 80, like no church, you know, like 20% of you, it's going to be a mess. And we expect that there's going to be that in any church that we're a part of. And I was just like, thank you for the graciousness on that side too, that in our desire to be healthy, it's a work in progress and we're not completely there in none of our churches. Right. But we're working toward that. And so, you know, having this this grace in there that we're in process, and that's part of the experience too. So wherever you're in the church health journey, Jason, we've kind of been through the ups and downs of all that stuff. So we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us, Jason or Jesse at reclaimleader.com, connect and talk church health. And maybe you got it sorted out, or maybe you're at the beginning and you're just going, this is intense, but we love being a part of the conversation, right?
Yeah. And if we can encourage you at all, we'll do it, because man, we really needed that.
Yeah, it's so
we
true.
still need it, but
yeah.
All right, everyone. Hey, thanks so much. As we always say, ministry is hard. It is so much better when we do it together. Take care.